Good day everyone and welcome in this video where I'm going to share with you a number of tips to counter Sorcerers and more specifically Magical Sorcerer in PvP. As you all know, Magical Sorcerer is in a really strong position right now. It's an S tier class and it's also a very popular spec to play, which means that a lot of the enemies you will encounter, no matter if it is in Cyrodiil or in Battlegrounds, are going to be Magical Sorcerers. And since it's a strong class, there's a lot of people that have struggles fighting it, and thus I thought it would be helpful if a Sorc main, me, would share some tips on what I find to be the most annoying things to fight, on what I think is the most effective when you're fighting me or any other Magical Sorcerer, to make their life more difficult. So as a first tip, I'm going to start with the kind of trope in fantasy games in general, where it's like if you're fighting a mage, get close into their face. And it's a trope, but it's no different in ESO as well, where if you're fighting a magical sorcerer, there's absolutely no point staying in range of them. That's where they like to fight, they are a ranged class, and thus one of the priorities that you should have is getting close in their face. Now there's a lot of ways to do that I want to share in this video as well. But the first and important thing to mention is that you need to have that mindset of getting close to them, when it's safe to do so, of course, if you're not gonna find yourself in a difficult spot to do so because you're surrounded by other enemies as well. But in general, if you're just fighting the Magsorc, you need to have the mindset of immediately going towards them, not waiting in range and casting buffs or defensive spells or anything like that. You need to immediately come in close to them, and you can do that with a gap closer. You can do that by just sprinting to them with major expedition and minor expedition. You can also use more swift traits on the jewelry that will make you faster in general. It's a good trait to have in PvP, but definitely against Sorcs it's also going to help a lot to get into their face faster, where you have a much easier time pressuring them, which is of course going to help you kill them, but also is going to increase your own defense, because when you pressure a Sorc he has to cast defensive skills like anybody else, which means that he will also have less time to just parse you in turn. But there are also specific gap closes that you can use that are annoying, and a couple that I want to mention is firstly Toppling Charge. This is the Templar gap closer. It's a common CC ability to use there next to Javelin, but if you find that you're having a lot of troubles with Sorcerer, I definitely would recommend using Toppling Charge over Javelin, if you are a melee Templar of course, because that will do that exact thing of getting close into their face that allows you to pressure them further. Another gap closer is an ultimate, and this is on Dragonite, which is Ferocious Leap or Take Flight. This is also a common skill to use, not against sorcerers specifically, but if you are fighting a lot of sorcerers, then you should consider using this more often. Now, it's also a bit of a buggy skill, because what happens is that when somebody casts Leap as you as a sorcerer and you're for example trying to roll dodge or run away, the Leap will force a standstill on you. The developers have implemented that in the game some time ago, I think with the idea to prevent Leap from missing, because in the past it could miss every now and then. Now it cannot anymore, because it forces you as a sorcerer to stand still for half a second, no matter if you are roll dodging or moving, and that's also an annoying thing to deal with that I have to mention. On top of that, you can also really catch a sorcerer off guard with that. If they start kiting away because for example they are in trouble, you can really do an instant high damage and CC on them that they might not see coming. It's definitely a lot better than using Corrosive against sorcerers, because as you probably know as a Dragonite, if you pop Corrosive and the sorcerer notices it, he can just do one streak or a couple of streaks and just wait it out for the 12 or so seconds that it lasts, which makes Corrosive generally not that useful for dealing damage to sorcerers. So I have already mentioned one counter that Dragonite has, which is Sleep, but they actually have 3 counters in total. The second counter that they have is Wings. Wings is a good ability, both morphs have their value, one of which is going to give you a snare and root removal as well, which is nice, especially if you are fighting outnumbered, or if you are trying to run up to a sorcerer, you can use this to remove snares while then running to them. And the Stealther Morph of Dragonfire skill is going to deal quite a bit of DPS to any projectile based enemy that is attacking you, and Sorcerer is basically all projectiles except for Curse, which means that every half a second you are going to be constantly proccing those fire attacks that it does, which creates a nice bit of extra pressure on a sorcerer. I think it's useful in other cases as well. For example, you can use it to counter Nightblade snipers as well. There's a lot of those going around, especially with sets like Antalmir's Construct and Tarnished Nightmare. It's a common problem you face as well, and Dragon Fire Scales or the other morph with his snare removal can help against this too. And then the third counter that Dragonite has is Change of Devastation. This is another gap closer, but also really sorcerer specific. So I don't advise that one too much, because against other classes you're not going to use it as much. You're really only using it to catch up to sorcerers over and over again. But this video would not be complete if I didn't mention it, because it's one of the most oppressive XV1 tactics that people use against sorcerers. Then the next counter is on the Warden class. They have the skill Shimmering Shield. It's a bit like the Dragon Wings, where it's a good defensive ability against any kind of ranged damage, so also that of Nightblade Snipers for example. But it's also going to have multiple purposes. One morph is going to deal some DPS to the enemy as well, it's going to stun them, sure, that's nice. And the other morph, Shimmering, is going to give you ultimate regeneration, and pretty good as well. Not just the base ult that it gives when you absorb a projectile, but also major heroism. I think that goes really nice with Warden, because one of the most common builds just relies on having Northern Storm up and making burst with that and mechanical acuity, and thus if you have the more ultimate regeneration you can get that Northern Storm ultimate faster, which means that you'll have it ready when your acuity procs. On the other hand, you can also kind of double dip with this skill in terms of defensive capabilities against the Magsorc, because not only do you have the ranged damage avoidance, the ultimate regeneration also allows you to cast your defensive ult quicker in case you need to. So if you have something like a Swordenbolt ultimate or a Resto Staff ultimate, that's also going to help you survive, of course, against anything. The next counter is a champion point, not a skill, and that one is the Bastion champion point. It's something that sorcerers will always use as it buffs their shield, but what is sometimes underestimated by people is the fact that it also has a secondary bonus where it's going to deal 15% more damage against shields. And of course sorcerers rely a lot on Hardened Ward, which means that against that you'll have a pretty significant damage bonus of 15%. I think this CP is definitely worth using if you're having trouble with Magsorc, because very often it's not that difficult to slot in the fitness tree, so in the red CPs. Often with the 4 slots you have one that is a flex spot, the other ones are most often Survival Instinct, Pain's Refuge and Sustained by Suffering. And then the 4th spot can be something like Celerity, which allows you to get to a sorcerer faster, or Relentlessness. But Bastion can fit there as well, and this is going to help you just kill a sorcerer, because it's going to give you more damage. I want to mention that it's also not only against Sorcerer. Another class against which this is useful is Arcanist, which also has a shield ability as its main defense. And it's a super tanky class, so having a damage bonus there is nice as well. And then lastly, with the scribing system, there's also a lot of shield skills in there that were added, often used by groups but also by solo players, and against that the Bastion CP will also be useful, so it's definitely worth considering. Then the next tip is to interrupt the Sorcerer, maybe one of the most obvious ones, but Sorcerer is a class that really eats sustain. Dark Conversion is a very important skill for them, and often even with that they don't have enough sustain and they need to use Rash Fatality on top, so it really says something about how important managing your resources is as a magical sorcerer. And thus they also need to cast Dark Conversion pretty often in order to keep the ability to streak around, to spam Hardened Ward and whatever else they do. The most obvious interrupt is just bash, so if you are on any kind of melee class, you can either predict the Dark Conversion when it will happen and try and stun them that way, but the easiest way to use a bash to counter a sorcerer is to just have it in your basic rotation at all times. For example, if you use Arterial Burst or any kind of other close range spammables such as the DK Whip, you can just use that every time you cast a spammable by doing light attack, skill and then bash. It's a good cancel to have against Sorcerer, because then basically you are constantly bashing them, and as soon as they cast Dark Conversion they will be stunned. You can also choose to only use this against Magsorcs, not against every other class, so it's not like you need to use this tactic everywhere. You can really kind of cater to specifically when you're fighting Magsorcs. Another good interrupt is Crushing Shock. This is maybe one of the most common ones that is being used as a skill. This is a ranged spammable that is going to be used very often by sorcerers, but also for example by Magicka Wardens or also by Templars when they have a ranged spec. So if you're struggling with Sorcerer on those specs, which I can definitely imagine because Sorcerer is like the strongest ranged class and these are also ranged specs sometimes but not as strong, well, in that case you can use Crushing Shock and try and interrupt the Sorcerer, mess up his sustain that way as well, get the stun and everything. That's going to help a lot with both offense and defense. A trick that I like to use when I'm using Crushing Shock is to not even stun the Sorcerer while I'm fighting him. I'm just waiting for him to cast Dark Conversion and using my rotations as per usual with Crushing Shock without stunning them. What that is going to cause is that the Sorcerer is going to wait too long before they cast Dark Conversion. At least from my perspective, I often wait with casting Dark Conversion until after I have been stunned by some ability, and then I break free, I cast a shield and I do 1 or 2 Dark Conversions. That happens pretty often. But if it happens that I don't get stunned very much, it can also happen that I forget to cast Dark Conversion because I don't have that trigger happening to me that says, okay, I'm safe to cast Dark Conversion now because I can't get interrupted while I'm immovable. So with all the Sorcerers, I imagine they think the same. I imagine that if you don't stun them that much while you have Crushing Shock, for example, they will wait too long before casting Dark Conversion, and thus right at the moment when they really need to cast it because they are out of Magicka, when they do that they're also going to get stunned, and then they're still out of Magicka and they're also drained of stamina and they need to break free. So that way you can also make a Sorcerer struggle more often. And then the last interrupt skill I have to mention is Venom Arrow. I see this one being used on occasion as well. I don't think it's that good of a skill in the past because it was just that interrupt and a dot, but these days it's also going to give you Major Brutality, so you can just use this skill as your buff of Major Brutality and then on top of that have that dot going on and have the interrupt to fight Magical Souls specifically. So if you have any kind of build with a bow in it, you can try slotting that skills as well for multiple purposes. Now, Venom Arrow is not really a spammable, you can't use it the same way as Crushing Shock, so your tactic has to be a bit different there. And specifically, I would suggest that you need to watch the Sorcerer in this case, and you need to watch until he tries to kite away because he's struggling. And for example, casting a shield and getting ready to cast Dark Conversion, you can kind of predict when that's going to happen, and at that moment you can shoot a Venom Arrow before that even happens and interrupt them right when they try to cast Dark Conversion. And then the last sword counter I want to talk about is not a skill or ACP, but it's more related to gameplay. So what 90% of sorcerers are going to do is they're going to make a burst rotation with just the first explosion of Haunting Curse. So that means they're going to cast Haunting Curse, then maybe a spammable, then a fragment, and then a stun with streak, or maybe they're going to cast Haunting Curse and then first streak and then a fragment, you know, whatever is most beneficial for them in a given situation. The burst combos can be really quite varied, but what most sorcerers are going to do is they're going to open up with a Haunting Curse every single time. So that means that it's also easy to predict when exactly they're going to make that burst, because you know when they cast Haunting Curse it will explode 3.5 seconds later, and they will also try to combine that explosion with, for example, a fragment proc or with a stun, and that means that if you can predict it, you can also prepare for this burst. So if you notice that the sorcerer has done that, you can just cast a buff or a heal or whatever that makes you help survive that, and then get back to the offensive afterwards. And then after that first curse has exploded, you can track when they cast that curse again. Anyway, that's it for all the tips I have in this video. I hope it has been useful. I think there's definitely more tips out there that you can give as well. If you have more things to share, you can always put them in the comments section so that other people can pick up these tips as well. Anyway, I thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!